We're talking about the problem of suffering. We're talking about the why. Bless you, and come out of her. And I'm looking for my laser pointer, which I perhaps have left on the book table, which is amazing. If that's the only slip-up I've made, I'm doing really well. Oh, yes, great. So we've suggested, thank you so much, a number of reasons why the problem of human suffering. It doesn't explain it away, but I think it does help. And for further study, if you were going to just get one thing from the table, it's that audio set from Facts to Faith. I brought just that one because it has a lesson on the problem of suffering. It's only 40 minutes long. It won't be everything we did today, but it's a good beginning. And if you want a serious book, I think C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain. It's really something. The problem of suffering. Oh, okay. Well, that was the last slide. So look how quickly we are into the question time. Here's how this will work. We have, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20, maybe 15. So if you have a question, please write it on a piece of paper. If you're very bold and you're a man of few words, ideally, or the female counterpart, then you can stand and say the question, but very short, so I can repeat it because it's being recorded. Otherwise, just write it on a piece of paper. And some alert sister or brother will run them up to me, and I can cover lots of questions when they're written, far more than when they're spoken. Okay? So we're in the time of questions. Thank you for hanging in there. It's so great to see most of you were able to stay the entire afternoon. If you were switching off with someone else, they are filming it, so you should be able to catch what you missed. Okay, so where are we? Now, if that just settles it and there are no questions, but I can't believe that because what I did today is I opened up many windows. And you may go away with even more questions than you had when you came. And that's not necessarily bad. Oh, great. How does Satan come into play in our study of suffering? Well, first, the Bible doesn't portray Satan as the counterpart of God, as though they're equal and opposite forces. You know, in physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Satan is not like God. Satan is not all-knowing. He's not omniscient. He's not everywhere at the same time. If I understand the Bible, he's not omnipresent. He's local. And he's smart and wily, but he's not that smart. In a way, he's a loser. Satan is involved. Satan seems to have power to make us suffer based on a couple passages in particular. The messenger of Satan, the thorn that troubled Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. Whatever that means, I'm not quite sure what that means, but he seems to have power to hurt. And then in Job, he seems to have the power to afflict Job. But I'm not quite sure how literally we're to take all that. I think you can understand Job without answering all the demonological questions you might have about Job. So how much is he allowed to do? Well, we know that all suffering is either caused by God or is permitted by God. I would just be slow to attribute everything to Satan. Oh, there's a thunderstorm. That's from Satan. Yeah, because it burned down my house. Well, I'm sorry it burned down your house, but it may have saved someone else's life. So it's a little bit complicated. We want attribution. That's from God, that's from the devil. It's easier in a binary world where everything's black and white. I would just say be careful. But Satan, if we look at the picture of the dragon in Revelation 12, this is part of my quiet time this morning, in fact. I was in the middle chapters of Revelation. He seems hell-bent, if I can use that phrase, hell-bent on inflicting suffering on as many people as he can. Can you explain rejoicing in our suffering? Paul says we rejoice in suffering. It's not so much we rejoice because we suffer, we rejoice more while we suffer, like in Acts 16 in prison. In a sense, we rejoice that we're suffering if we're suffering as Christ suffered, Philippians 3. But this is not masochistic. Oh yeah, I want to suffer. but we're to rejoice. And rejoice doesn't mean you're happy about the suffering. In fact, I think you can be profoundly unhappy about the suffering, but still rejoice. Joy is a spiritual quality. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. How can you tell if suffering is discipline from God, Hebrews 12, or thorn from Satan? That's a good question. I don't think you can always know, which is one good reason to pray about it. But I'll tell you this, whether it's from Satan or not, God is testing you. I mean, it will test your mettle. It will demonstrate the worth of your faith. Oh, now we're getting so many great questions. This is super. This is what I love. Now stop. Oh, no, I can't stop it. Yeah, I'm kidding. The Bible talks a better resurrection. Yes, it does. In Hebrews 11, I did a podcast on that yesterday. It will be going live in a couple of weeks. Hebrews 11:35, referring to 2 Maccabees 7:7, about the woman and the 7 children who refused to be released. They embraced torture so they could have a better resurrection. And I don't know if that means more reward in heaven, or if that meant more, it's the resurrection of the righteous is better than being resurrected when you're unrighteous. You could take that either way. But this question continues to ask about rewards in heaven. So that may or may not be connected to Jesus' phrase, rewards in heaven. But rewards in heaven is biblical. Well, isn't heaven the reward? Yeah, but Jesus talks about storing up treasure in heaven. I think we can go too far with this, but it's not right to just dismiss it entirely. The more you put in, the more you get out. We can both attend the same party. Both of us could have a good time, but you have a blast, and I'm just smiling. Because you're just different. You have a different experience of it than me. Maybe because you organized, or maybe because you invited so many people. Others can attend the same party, but their level of joy is not quite the same. And so levels or treasure in heaven, I think, could refer to our experience of heaven, as opposed to, I get a better stateroom on the heavenly cruise. How should we feel about being motivated to suffer for these rewards? Should we be motivated to suffer? Well, I think Philippians 3 gives you the right balance on that. I'll just mess it up if I try to explain it. Disasters happen in different parts of the world. What's your response when people refer to it as an act of God? Yeah, like insurance companies. If it's an act of God, we won't pay you anything. If you're killed by lightning, that's an act of God. Well, I think a lot of times it's a cop-out. Does God want people to suffer? Well, it's part of his overall plan in producing character. Everything is caused by God, or else it's permitted by God. I just don't think we can always say what is exactly an act of God. I would be tempted to say more. I can't remember the title. I did a podcast 2 years ago on that, on the Christian response to disasters. And I've given some balance and some notes there if you're interested. This looks like a long one. Let's see if it's too long. People with mental illness who don't improve and they die, or they even commit suicide. Would God have grace and mercy? I'll just answer that part of the question. We cannot say. Some Christians, usually pretty young ones, like to say, oh, if you kill yourself, then there's no forgiveness. And I don't know. I certainly don't think that if you kill yourself, you're automatically forgiven of killing yourself. But it's just a little bit difficult to analyze an area that the Bible doesn't give us very much information on.
That's not a question.
This is not about a suicide. This is about a homicide. Someone who's going to be killed if he doesn't move his car. It's a Pilot SUV, 461 6GY or 461, looks like 6GY. You're blocking someone in, and he needs to go home, and so you don't tempt him beyond what he can endure. So he doesn't kill you. If you could move that, that'd be really good. Okay, we're talking about suicide. Oh, happy topics. There's 7 suicides in the Bible, by the way. I don't remember if I did a podcast on that or not. So there was a brother in one of the churches in Ireland who had a chemical imbalance. And he felt things very profoundly. But part of his condition was that he couldn't drive. And let's just say his family members really pushed him to have brain surgery, which would deal with his emotionalism, but the side effect was you may not feel anything. And his wife pushed him, and he got the operation. But afterwards, he could no longer feel the joy and the sadness that he felt before. He felt like he wasn't doing well spiritually because he just couldn't really feel God anymore. He became convinced he committed the unforgivable sin, though I don't think he did. He went to the park to hang himself. They found him before he succeeded. But they let him out of the institution 3 weeks later, and this second time he succeeded. I remember because it was one of my trips to Ireland. I said, "How's so-and-so doing?" He said, "You haven't heard." "No, I haven't heard." "What?" "You took his life." Did he take it because he was rejecting God and completely selfish? Or to put it a different way, to what extent does distorted thinking exonerate us from the responsibility to be giving to others? I mean, you know this is going to hurt people if you take your life. But don't we all act really differently when we're in extreme pain and extreme despondency? That's why I don't think we can really answer that one decisively. I couldn't say, "Oh yeah, there's no hope for him." On the other hand, I don't want to be giving my blessing on every suicide. God is gracious, but that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want and get away with it. It means He's the one who decides. If God punishes the wicked in the Old Testament, how can we be sure He's not punishing us today? Maybe He's punishing us today when bad things happen, like Haiti and voodooism. Well, maybe you cannot be certain. But let me tell you one reason I reject the attribution of Haiti's poverty to voodoo. I would agree that part of it is voodoo, in that when people believe in lies that prevent them from more productive and constructive paths, then that will tend to reinforce poverty, and that'll be used by power to keep them in line, like the opium of the people that Karl Marx talked about in his critique of the philosophy of Hegel. Now, I was saying something. You need to move your car. Nope. When it's an act of God. What was I just saying there? Oh, voodoo, yeah. But the reason I think it's wrong, I knew there was a thought in there, is that would suggest that the phenomenal wealth of this country must be because we're righteous. We're a Christian nation founded on Christian principles. Yeah, like using black slaves and pushing out the Asiatic peoples who lived here before and made us great. And then later on with Manifest Destiny, so we could get the whole continent sea to shining sea. And the Monroe Doctrine and all the other doctrines. That's because we're righteous. Well, no, some of it just because you had more guns. You had more people. It's not necessarily because you were more righteous. Why don't we talk about human trafficking in the church? Well, I did mention it. I guess that didn't count. What you probably wanted was a real discussion of it. I don't have an answer for that very specific thing, though I've talked to some people who are involved with that. I think many churches are focused more on just experiencing a slow and steady growth in numbers than they are in really stepping out and tackling the problems of the world. And probably because we don't see very much human trafficking in eastern Massachusetts. And we're overwhelmed by life. Now, if we're not overwhelmed by life, you know what that means? It means we've got more energy and time. And if that's you, maybe that's an area where you can serve. The church's primary role is not to reverse slavery, nor was it in the first century. But the abolition of slavery is a natural result when those in power are affected by Christian ideals. So we mustn't mistake the gospel for the social gospel. These are not the same. Genesis 2:9, it said God created the tree of good and evil. And I said God didn't create evil. Okay, he didn't create the tree of good and evil. He created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Firstly, I think it's all metaphor. But for the sake of argument, let's take it literally. The whole thing literal. Talking snake, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. By eating that fruit, and it was a papaya. The ancient Hebrew manuscripts say it was papaya. No, it doesn't say. Any more than it says the other fruit was, you know what apple, you know the thing about apple, right? Not Steve Jobs' apple. Apple. Malum in Latin. Malum is apple, malum is evil. But God didn't create evil. It was the knowledge of good and evil. So by experiencing whatever they experienced, they had some knowledge of good and evil. So I think that answers that. Mental diseases, schizophrenia, how does that connect with this? Very much. It connects with our discussion of suffering on the level of the one who's suffering and on the willingness of others to make a difference and be involved. And that's why I applaud those who serve as Christian psychiatrists, Christian psychologists. When rape, murder, or other horrible evil happens to a Christian, how can we offer comfort to those who don't yet believe? When we're touched, I think you mean not murdered, but we're affected by rape or murder. When evil happens to a disciple, how can we offer comfort to those who don't yet believe? Well, sometimes if we're in the middle of pain ourselves, we're not going to be much good at offering to anyone anything. But I will say staying engaged and not feeling sorry for yourself and doing what the experts recommend, steady diet, sleep, exercise, sunlight, those basic things can make a huge difference. And you know your patterns. You know your heart. Can you explain long-suffering? Well, it's an archaic English word, but it's patience. Let's say, I would explain it this way. Long-suffering is a willingness to endure for decades, not just for 20 minutes, but for 20 years. This is a question about Satan and birth defects. I don't think Satan has anything to do with birth defects. I think birth defects happen because there are genetic accidents. There's a high level of randomness in our world. I think biology and physics have shown that beyond any reasonable doubt. You can say it's Satan. I wouldn't say that, and I wouldn't say it was sin. I would say what Jesus said in John 9, but that the glory of God may be revealed. Not that God allowed the birth defects to glorify himself, as though he's tinkering with his creations, but not to explain the causality, but simply to affirm our faith that even in this, God can be glorified. Of course, many birth defects are operable. You know, I think a cleft palate, because when I was in the burn hospital, they also help. Cleft palate is such an easy one to fix. But this is an opportunity for grace, for ministry. Is sin directly related to suffering? More indirect. When we sin, we're going to suffer more. We're going to make other people suffer more. How do we come to grips with the eternal destiny of the multitudes who die because of weather, like tsunamis, or conflict, like the Holocaust? How do we come to grips with their eternal destiny? Well, firstly, understanding I don't decide that. First time I was in Cambodia and looking at the pictures of all the men and women who were executed, I couldn't stop thinking about hell. You're going to go insane if you just want to meditate on hell all day. But I will tell you, my next book is on heaven and hell. That's coming out March 1st. Someone needs to think about it. part of how I came to terms with it, I'm not speaking for whatever church you're part of, but for me. And what I've been teaching for over 20 years, and there's a tiny blue book on the table called What Happens After We Die. For some reason, they stuck in there as an appendix my little paper on terminal punishment. My understanding of the Scriptures is not that anyone would be in hell forever, infinite torment. And I've not taught that since probably 1990. But that it comes to an end when it needs to come to an end, depending on what people deserve. Whether it's 1,000,000 years or 5 months or 1 minute, God is in control of that. That's my personal view. I think it's scriptural, but take a look if you're interested. What about heaven? Well, heaven, yeah, I mean, that's March 1st, okay? When a Christian dies, when a Christian dies, does that Christian keep an awareness of us? Like, are they aware that we're here? I think the Bible seems to indicate they know they're still conscious, but aware of us, if you mean, are they watching you? No. And I deal with that in the book too. I mean, it's quite a thought. Often preachers portray the dead as an upper gallery. They're in the stands watching us on the floor, and they're watching us all the time. Don't let them down. They're looking at you when you eat your breakfast. When you had your Apple Jacks this morning, they were watching. But then I had a shower. Were they watching that? Oh no, they averted their eyes. Are the dead aware of what we're doing? I doubt it very much. Only if you literalize the metaphor of Hebrews 12. But no, I don't think they know what we're doing. But maybe they have better IT now. Who knows? Maybe there's some... I referred to the death of Rebecca in the second session. Does the Bible tell us when she died? No. No, we can talk about that later on to tell us when she died. I mean, this would have been probably the 19th century BC, something like that, 18th century. I can sort of understand the importance of developing a cruciform life. Good. If you can sort of understand it, that's very positive. But how does one explain the reason for disaster or natural disaster when many people die? Well, I'm not claiming that God allows a tsunami so that those who are being swept away will develop a cruciform life. I hope you don't think I'm saying that. I'm saying the function of suffering in life is intended to push us towards God. You get married, after some period of time, you have to make a choice. Is it just about me or about the other? And if you make the right choice, you're actually on the way to embracing God. As a mother or father, if you are disengaged, that's one thing. But if you love and sacrifice and you're engaged, you're making a choice that also is not unlike God's divine love. So, suffering in general, I wasn't talking about cruciform life coming from a tsunami. Our response to it, though, is an opportunity for us who are surviving to live a cruciform life. Like, do we care? Some things are black and white, some are gray. In my personal study, do I study it until it's familiar and I get direction, or are there exact answers? If I understand the question, sometimes there are no exact answers. And the mark of maturity is being willing to keep going even if you're not totally certain. But I believe on faith that the major issues of this world and of the Bible are black and white. Like the 7 unities of Ephesians 4, one hope, one body, one spirit, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God. Basic things. Skeletal truths, I call them. Like your skeleton. I mentioned my friend Jim before. If he stood up, he has a skeleton. Well, he's not starving, so the skeleton's not dead obvious right now. But I promise you it's in there. Your skeleton is actually phenomenally light. If you ever held the skeleton, a human skeleton, have you held that before? It's really light, but strong. It has hard edges. That's why breaking a bone hurts. Ow. But that's hard. You could say black and white. But it gives structure to everything else. Other parts are more plastic, softer, more flexible, more pliable. And it's that way in the Bible. Some things are more gray, they're more flexible, but there are some bedrock truths. And don't you mess with those. We're almost at the end. Does God allow you to have a choice in your pain? You can pick your poison, I guess. Did Judas Iscariot have a choice? I think he had a choice, but I think he crossed the point of no return, because at one point in the gospel it says, and then Satan entered him. I think he's saying we can get to a point where we're broken, like Proverbs 29:1, where there's no way to repair it. We can keep going until we're actually trashed. I only have two more here. Why does God allow the death of innocent children, such as that in Connecticut in December? Because we have free will. You're thinking that God should take away free will. You realize that would be the end of all of us. Well, no, I just want him to stop bad things from happening. And that's not the way it works. We can try to stop bad things from happening. That's actually not God's responsibility. That's human responsibility. Yeah, but God should turn bullets into feathers. Really? And when you have a wicked thought in your head, he should change it to a thought of shamrocks, something innocuous. He should play with your head, and you think you'd still be human? Are you crazy? This is what we do to each other. It's what we do. And last, our culture keeps us out of touch with real suffering. That's right. As Americans, we are in a position to affect change in the rest of the world. War, murder, drones, and so forth. What is our responsibility as citizens? How do you view a Christian's involvement politically to stop unconstitutional wars? I think if we take our lead from Jesus, he was not unwilling to challenge power, but he did not call his followers to change the world through political processes. In fact, that wasn't the way the church did it for hundreds of years. Not until they fell in love with the world. They showed the world an alternate community. They showed that there is another kingdom with its own laws and government. A kingdom where the rules are radically different to the rules down here. It's not about rights and who's right and what my rights are. It's not about the pursuit of happiness. It's about the pursuit of holiness. That's what he showed. And so I think we're barking up the wrong tree. We need to care. That doesn't mean that I have to devote my life to political activism. Could I do that? Yeah, I think I could do that. But I would tread carefully. It's dangerous. There are certain fields where Christians get involved that are perilous. They're very perilous. Like professional sports. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it takes a special character not to get sucked in to that culture. The arts and acting are certainly that way. I would never say, you should really be an actor. But if you are and you're anchored in the Word of God, I think you might be able to do some good. But for most people, that's the end of them spiritually. So what did Jesus do? What was his relationship to the power structures of the time? May be different from those of the person who asked that question, that last very interesting question.